Hi, and welcome to this channel. This is going to be my first video on this channel in which I will be covering the mergers and acquisitions activity around Warner Brothers Discovery Incorporated involving Netflix, Paramount Skydance, and potentially Comcast. But yeah, let's get right into it. So we'll start out with the acquisition thesis. So why is Warner Brothers Discovery a company that is available for acquisition or vulnerable to acquisition depending on how you look at it? And the issue is that this is a publicly traded company and its market equity value no longer reflects the control value of its intellectual property. So when we're thinking about intellectual property with a company like Warner Brothers, that includes things like Harry Potter, The Matrix, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, massive IPs worth billions and billions of dollars. However, the company itself, which is essentially a holding company, Warner Brothers Discovery Incorporated, is weakened in the markets because it is highly levered. It does do relatively poorly in streaming. They have HBO Max, which is one of the bigger streaming platforms, but they still lag behind Netflix, Amazon, Disney, and strategically it's not been going well. Um, in fact, they've recently been thinking, before they were thinking about an acquisition, they were thinking about splitting off themselves between maybe just the IP and just the streaming, which may have worked better. But since it is still together, the poor function of their streaming has actually pushed down the value of the entire company so much that it could be worth it for other companies to come in and buy out the company just to gain access to those extremely valuable IPs. So let's talk about why would another company want to come in and do this. So essentially what that Netflix and Paramount would be looking at with Warner Brothers is just that massive collection of intellectual properties. And then again, Warner Brothers Discovery does have a net debt on their balance sheet of $34 billion, so it would have to be one of the major players in the industry in order to take on that debt and in order to field that in their balance sheet. And then aside from that, what a company would be looking at here is pairing those Warner Brothers intellectual properties with a more robust streaming network and a better distribution strategy, which especially Netflix would be really good at. And let's go ahead and talk more about Netflix. So they're looking to boost their streaming catalog, and the way that they're looking to do this, obviously, in this acquisition is through access to those Warner Brothers IPs. Lately, a lot of their strategy has been based on their Netflix originals. They've not been trying to necessarily buy IPs until now. They've had some mixed success when you think about shows like Stranger Things, massive successes, but then there have also been pretty expensive, massive losses. So I'd say it's very much been a mixed strategy. Not all bad with the Netflix originals, but definitely not what Netflix wants to continue to grow. And they've not been extremely active in M&A lately or even ever in their history. So this is a really interesting step from them, not just into kind of mid-level mergers and acquisitions, but into the very top echelon of what you're expecting out of mergers and acquisitions with this one. With a market cap over $400 billion and backers, financiers who we'll talk about, they're more than able to take on that net debt that Warner Brothers has on their balance sheet. And again, this would potentially secure Netflix as by far the runaway leader in streaming. And as we'll mention later, it might even bring up some monopolization, some antitrust issues. And then we'll talk about the second competitor that are competing in a much different way. This is Paramount Skydance. And what they want to do here is they really want to establish themselves as a top player in streaming, right? They want to establish themselves up there with Netflix, Disney, and Amazon. And this is a pretty recent, I'd say ambitious company. They actually just recently formed through the merger of Paramount Global, National Amusements, and Skydance Media to form what is now Paramount Skydance. And they are backed both by the Ellison family. Their owner is David Ellison, son of sometimes richest man in the world, Larry Ellison, and also the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, which is a near $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. And formerly, I'll get to that later, but Affinity Partners, Jared Kushner's firm, was backing this venture, but they just recently fell out after I made this, actually. So they were actually the ones that started. It was David Ellison himself went to talk to Warner Brothers CEO David Zaslav about an acquisition. He actually went straight to his house one night, I believe, which is not a standard practice in M&A. And their initial bid was $19 per share for the entire company. I believe around that time, this was in September, I believe around that time, Warner Brothers Discovery stock was at about $12, $13 per share. And then from there, that was rejected. This was going to be a part stock, part cash offer. I believe it was like 60% cash. Zaslav, who has been around the industry, came from New York and then now is working in media in LA, rejected the bid because, as I mentioned earlier, they were planning to restructure internally, maybe split off streaming from the IPs to kind of separate that and make each stronger by themselves. And then Paramount quickly increased the bid to $22 per share, which is already coming up a lot more than their market value was at the time. And then eventually $23.50 per share. This was all before Netflix even got involved, and this got up to 80% cash. When you're being acquired, of course, you always want cash if you can. So this is already a pretty attractive offer. And at this time, as these bids from Paramount come in, the market price adjusts because people are anticipating that they would get that payout or they would get a better stock as part of Paramount if they were acquired. So that's why the market price rises as those bids rise. And all of these Paramount approaches were refused by Zaslav management and the board of Warner Brothers. And then that's when Netflix really comes in. And then Comcast, who I'll just mention quickly, is kind of like a third player. At this point, they're kind of counted out because it's looking more and more like it'll be Netflix, although Paramount still has a chance. Comcast is kind of like a last resort. And then so the first round of bidding, Paramount offered $25.50 per share for the entire company. So we'll talk about that. Netflix was making offers for just the streaming and IP assets. Paramount was making offers for the entire company, which includes cable networks and Warner Brothers' share in the CW, which is another network. And then Netflix and Comcast also made non-binding bids for just the studios and HBO Max streaming. And then all three of those first round bids were rejected by the company. Second round bids came in. These were binding. Netflix offered $28 per share for studio and streaming assets. Again, a very generous offer. I believe the market price is now hovering around $29 per share. So that just gets boosted as these shares increase, as these bids increase rather. And then Paramount offered $26.50 all cash for the entire company. And then, of course, Warner Brothers ended up deciding that they would rather do business with Netflix regardless of the specifics of the exact offer. So they chose Netflix for exclusive negotiations. The Netflix deal that they offered and that they were negotiating with Warner Brothers would have valued the assets that they were looking to acquire at $82.7 billion. So a massive, massive sum for IPs. And that is backed by debt financing from Wells Fargo, HSBC, and BNP Paribas. So those are kind of like their main financiers. And then Paramount entered with a final offer for $30 all cash. And that was actually going to be a hostile takeover, meaning that Paramount realized that there was really no more negotiating that they could do with the board and with the management because they had already sided with Netflix. But of course, you can still appeal directly to the shareholders, which are the ultimate owners and deciders of the company's fate. So that $30 all cash tender offer would go directly to the shareholders and kind of take the management and take the board of directors out of the equation. And that total package would end up at $108 billion all cash from Paramount. So then let's talk about what is kind of making this case harder to go through as far as an acquisition and what kind of gives Paramount a chance here, even though Warner Brothers has clearly signaled that they prefer Netflix's bid. So Paramount actually, as part of their hostile takeover initiation, they released a letter raising antitrust concerns about the potential Netflix-Warner Brothers deal. They stated that it would potentially create a 43% global market share in the subscription video on-demand market, which would give Netflix some pricing power, some monopolization power, and just potentially a concern for trust-busting monopolization, not something that would be good for global competition in the streaming services. And then on top of that, if Warner Brothers decides to break up so to say, with Netflix and accept another bid, they would owe Netflix a $2.8 billion breakup fee, which is already massive. But on the other side, if Netflix's deal fails with Warner Brothers, they'll owe $5.8 billion to Warner Brothers in a breakup fee, which again would be one of the largest of that kind ever, and legally possibly implausible because it's usually only 3 to 4% of the complete deal's value in a breakup fee. And then again, because Paramount was making their almost $110 billion all cash tender offer, they had to add in that premium of about $3 billion to compensate Warner Brothers for that breakup fee that they would have to pay. So that just goes to increase Paramount's bid. And then as far as what are those political and regulatory concerns, it's just the scale and the influence of this deal that make both regulators, politicians, and the public involved in this. So this is another example of a big tech firm that's trying to achieve complete vertical integration. So in Netflix's case, they'd own the studios, they'd own the content, and they'd own the distribution, which is potentially a concern for all of the shareholders and stakeholders and workers in the film and media industry. And then as far as the current administration, President Trump's second administration, they have generally been skeptical of big tech concentration. I'm sure you've seen in the news, very skeptical of Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, all of that. The party is, or at least the administration is typically anti-big tech, but at the same time, the administration has been very pro-big M&A, which kind of creates some tension between this is an M&A deal that the administration would typically approve of, but it's also a case of big tech power increase, which the administration would typically not approve of. And then to really add some heat to the fire, on the other side, Jared Kushner's affinity partners was the ones, or were part of the coalition that was backing Paramount. But recently, Jared Kushner's affinity partners have dropped out of the deal, so that made Netflix's chances to land this deal jump up even more. Jared Kushner is, of course, the son-in-law of President Donald Trump. I believe he's married to his daughter Ivanka. But they recently pulled out because Warner Brothers management and Warner Brothers board of directors made an open letter to their shareholders telling them to reject Paramount's tender offer. And then let's talk about the advisors, because this is something that I'm interested in. I think a lot of people that are interested in M&A are mainly interested in what the advisors are doing, how the investment banks are involved. So we'll talk about the sell-side advisors on Warner Brothers Discovery Incorporated side. So they're employing both bulge bracket and elite boutique to try to help this go through. First, they have Allen & Company, which is one you may not have heard of. This is a bit of a boutique investment bank, but they're really elite and specialize in media and entertainment. So this type of thing is right up their alley and would 100% be one of their biggest ever deals, if not their biggest ever. Then, of course, you've got JP Morgan, just a massive company, massive resources as far as both analysts, work, data that they can use, and then also capital is on their side as well. And then you have Evercore, probably the biggest of the elite boutiques, absolutely elite when it comes to sell-side advisory. And then as far as legal counsel, they've got Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Kratz, and then Debois and Plimpton, which are advising on the M&A and regulatory strategy because there are regulatory concerns here. And then we'll talk about Netflix on the buy side. We've got their lead advisor is Moelis & Company, another elite boutique, very good on M&A, both sell side and buy side. And then we've got, for another secondary advisory as well as financial backing, as I mentioned earlier, they've got Wells Fargo working. So they're providing both capital for the deal and advisory on the deal. And then because of, again, the regulatory and antitrust risk, as well as the breakup fees that they may have to navigate, they've retained Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, a law firm. And then last but not least, we've got Paramount Skydance's advisors. So as I mentioned earlier, they have a ton of financial backers here, and a lot of who their advisors are on this buy-side deal are the kind of the advisory arms of their advisors. So we've got Redbird Advisors, Bank of America Securities, Citi Investment Banking, and then Apollo Global Management that also does advisory as well as private financing. And then their lead financial advisor is Centerview Partners, a firm that's comparable to Evercore, another elite investment boutique advisory firm. And then their legal advisor is Kravitz, Swaine and Moore, arguably the top name, if not one of the top names in M&A law. And then finally, just to wrap it up, let's talk about kind of the more qualitative or popular outcomes, because this is an M&A case that's not just interesting to people who are interested in M&A and business deals, but also for the public. You'll see a lot of people talking about this that know nothing about how these kind of things work, but it is something that will affect people's lives, especially people that watch a lot of TV. So, as I mentioned earlier, Warner Brothers is really favoring Netflix's bid. And just in the last couple days, they've publicly stated that they prefer Netflix's bid. They've urged their shareholders to ignore Paramount's tender offer. And because of that, Netflix has become like a 3-1 favorite to land this deal on prediction markets. And if they do so, as I mentioned before, that would really cement its top position and create possibly a monopoly on a powerful intellectual property and lead to serious antitrust scrutiny. And then if Paramount wins, the acquisition could launch Paramount all the way up to the top, competing with Netflix, if not making them the outright number one. If you're to really pair Paramount's ambition right now with this massive list of IPs, they could really do some interesting things as far as distribution and promotion to try to make that count for them. And then last thing I want to mention, regardless of who gets that, it looks like it'll be Netflix, but if Paramount does get it, it means they'll have to come up with an even more massive offer. I believe that this will be done at a price that's a bit too high. They've already negated that discount that I mentioned first about how the market was discounting those IPs because it was paired with a pretty bad distribution service. This bidding war has already more than made up for that, and they will be getting these IPs at a massive premium. So if they do get this, Netflix or Paramount, they're really going to have to work to make it worth it for them. And that wraps that up. Feel free to comment, reach out to me. I'll try to answer any questions I can, talk with anybody I can. Thank you.